beyond. Right here on Pearl's Saturday Night Scares.
Former chief executive calls for public support for the political reform framework.
Whatever these murderers think they'll achieve by killing innocent Americans like Stephen, they have already failed.
Another American journalist is beheaded by Islamic State. And a fragile ceasefire agreement is reached for eastern Ukraine. Good evening. Former Chief Executive Tung Chee-hwa called on the Hong Kong people today to accept the political reform framework unveiled by the National People's Congress Standing Committee. And as Evelina Leung reports, Tung is against the Occupy Central protest movement, and some students plan to boycott classes.
Former Chief Executive Tung Chee-hwa, who is also a vice chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, will soon be heading to Beijing with a group of businessmen. Today, he held his first press conference at the office of former chief executives since he stepped down from his post in 2005 to talk about the SAR's political reform. He said he supports the NPC Standing Committee's decision on the SAR's political reform framework, but admitted it is conservative, and so he understands the Pan-Democrats' disappointment and anger towards it. But he stressed it is now a critical time for Hong Kong, so people need to calm down and take a step back.
Between 1997 and 2017, a short time of 20 years, we have moved from having a British parachute to a governor into Hong Kong to having 5 million voters choosing their own leader. In the grand sweep of history, this is a glittering achievement.
Tung said Hong Kong people cannot let the territory stand still as it is about to take its biggest political leap. He also said having some 5 million people choose their own chief executive is not airy-fairy democracy. It is democracy real and substantial. He also said people can't just blindly make demands.
We have to understand the background. If you and I are going to have a discussion trying to solve a problem, I have to understand your problem, you have to understand my problem, then we can solve the problem, right? And this is not happening right now.
Tung also stressed whether there will be any amendments made to the reform framework will depend on the situation. Some criticized the former CE for his remarks.
I think what he aimed at is not on the Legislative Council member in the Democratic camp. What he target at is the so-called the public at large, or especially for those who didn't have a very decisive role on the NPC decisions.
而家特區政府嘅特首梁振英
Pan-Democratic lawmaker Frederick Fung, meanwhile, said Tung's speech probably means government officials are finding it difficult to convince the public to accept the political reform framework, so they are looking for help. Another Pan-Democrat, Emily Lau, also criticized the former CE. Given his conservative background, not many people will believe he really wants to see genuine universal suffrage implemented in Hong Kong, she said. Evelyn Lang, TVB News.
Former Governor Chris Patten has appealed to the British government to speak up for Hong Kong. In a newspaper article, Patten said it's not to provoke China, but a reminder that Britain has a duty it needs to honour. Diane To reports.
In the article entitled "Britain is honour-bound to speak up for Hong Kong," the city's last governor wrote that he had been avoiding the democracy debate here for fear his involvement may complicate matters. He pointed out that his comments this time are not directed principally to Beijing, but to invite an interrogation of Britain's sense of honour. Chinese officials have often criticised the British for commenting on developments in Hong Kong. Most recently, a UK parliamentary probe into the SAR's democratic progress sparked a warning letter from the Foreign Affairs Committee. And today, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs made it clear China was unhappy about what it called foreign interference on the issue. Ministry spokesman Qin Gang called on the world to see that one country, two systems is a success, adding any finger-pointing or irresponsible comments over Hong Kong was in vain. In the article, Patton wrote that these attacks ignore the fact that Britain too has treaty obligations for 50 years, which reflect what our country has said and promised in the past. He said failure to do as pledged would clearly be dishonourable. Patton also claimed that no one envisaged that 30 years after the joint declaration, a fair electoral system would still be beyond the horizon. The Sino-British joint declaration makes no mention of universal suffrage, however, and writes that the chief executive is to be appointed by the Central People's Government. But Patton's article pointed out that the declaration guarantees Hong Kong's way of life for 50 years after 1997. Saying this is backed by an international treaty lodged at the UN, he insisted the UK has a moral and political obligation to ensure that China respects its commitments. Appealing to Westminster, Patton said that speaking up for Hong Kong is not a provocation but a duty, and that commercial consequences should not be an overriding concern when honour is on the line. Diane To, TVB News.
Train services on the MTR's Kwun Tong line were delayed by 15 to 20 minutes this morning after a crack was found on a railway track near the Diamond Hill station. Stephanie Choi reports.
Platforms at the Kowloon Tong station were more crowded than usual as MTR workers inspected railway tracks along the Kwun Tong line. The MTR Corporation said at around 6 a.m., workers looking into an unstable signaling system found a crack on one of its railway tracks near the Diamond Hill station. For safety reasons, trains had to be operated manually. Services on the Kwun Tong line were delayed by 15 to 20 minutes. I'm so annoyed with the frequent glitches, this commuter said. MTR staff had to implement crowd control measures at stations along the Kwun Tong line. Some turnstiles had to be shut down to relieve pressure on the crowded platforms. Workers later secured the railway track with clamps, and after about 2 hours, trains were back under automatic operation. Normal train services resumed at around 9:05. Secretary for Transport and Housing Anthony Cheung said while the severity of today's incident remains to be seen, if necessary, the government will ask the MTR to do a comprehensive evaluation on its railway system. For now, he said, the railway company will have to turn in a report on today's incident to the Transport Department. Stephanie Choi, TVB News.
The Food and Health Bureau has announced that live poultry imports from the mainland will resume tomorrow. The decision comes after a ban that lasted more than 6 months due to the detection of the H7 influenza virus in a batch of live poultry. The first shipment of more than 500 pigeons arrives tomorrow. Chickens will follow soon afterwards. The Food and Health Bureau says all Hong Kong-bound live poultry will be subjected to testing during a 5-day quarantine period beforehand. Overseas, the Islamic State militant group has released another video purporting to show the beheading of a second American hostage. The U.S. National Security Council says the video is authentic. The killing of journalist Steven Sotloff further raises the stakes in the confrontation between the extremist group and Washington over U.S. airstrikes on insurgents in Iraq. Alan Buckner reports.
31-year-old Sotloff, a freelance journalist, was kidnapped in Syria just over a year ago. As with the execution 2 weeks ago of another American journalist, James Foley, Sotloff had a message for U.S. President Barack Obama.
Your foreign policy of intervention in Iraq was supposed to be for the preservation of American lives and interests. So why is it that I'm having to pay the price of your interference with my life?
The man appearing behind Sotloff is believed to be the same London-accented man seen on August 19th in the killing of James Foley. Again, there was another hostage shown at the end of the video, identified as British citizen David Cawthorne Haynes. U.S. President Barack Obama expressed shock and grief at the murder of Sotloff, but said American policy remains unchanged.
Whatever these murderers think they'll achieve by killing innocent Americans like Stephen, they have already failed. They failed because, like people around the world, Americans are repulsed by their barbarism. We will not be intimidated. Their horrific acts only unite us as a country and stiffen our resolve to take the fight against these terrorists.
Obama has ordered 350 more troops to be sent to Iraq to protect the American embassy in Baghdad. That brings the number of military personnel there up to 820. Alan Bukniat, TVB News.
Russia and Ukraine have reached a ceasefire agreement over eastern Ukraine. But pro-Moscow rebels rejected the move, saying no truce was possible without a pullback by Kiev. Tony Sabine reports.
Government troops ambushed by pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. Dozens of Ukrainian military vehicles in charred piles. Kiev, Washington and NATO said the rebel offensive was the result of direct Moscow military support. But now, a breakthrough. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko's office announced today he and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin reached agreement on a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. A statement says mutual understanding was reached regarding the steps that will contribute to the establishment of peace. The two leaders had been discussing a settlement and were said to largely share views on ways out of the crisis.
It's too early to tell what the ceasefire means. If, in fact, Russia is prepared to stop financing, arming, training, in many cases joining with Russian troops, activities in Ukraine, and is serious about a political settlement, that is something that we all hope for.
Amid fears of Russian aggression in the region, Obama arrived in Estonia in a show of solidarity with Baltic states. The visit comes before the start of a NATO summit in Wales tomorrow. His administration has said there are plans to position at least 4,000 troops and military equipment in Eastern Europe, bolstering NATO's security commitments there.
The United States, in cooperation with our allies, plans to significantly increase the readiness of a NATO response force to ensure that the alliance is prepared to respond to threats in a timely fashion.
The President really is facing an impossible task of reassuring allies that inherently cannot be reassured to the degree that they want to be reassured simply because of their geography, because of their history, because of the very difficult relationship they now have with Russia. Putin, in a sense, is cornered at this point because domestically he cannot accept a defeat in Ukraine.
Tony Sabine, TVB News.
Another warning tonight that the Ebola outbreak in West Africa is spiraling out of control. This from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, in the United States. Sonia Artero reports.
Leading health experts admit the world is losing the battle against Ebola.
Despite tremendous efforts from the U.S. government, from CDC, from within countries, the number of cases continues to increase and is now increasing rapidly.
This is the largest and most severe and most complex Ebola outbreak ever seen in nearly 40 years' history of this disease.
Responsible for more than 1,500 deaths, the CDC is calling on experts around the globe to help tackle three key needs.
The first are more resources. This is going to take a lot to confront. The second are technical experts in healthcare and management to help in country. And the third is a global, coordinated, unified approach.
There are more than 3,000 people infected with Ebola now, but that number is expected to jump to 20,000. In the hardest hit areas of West Africa, too few doctors are containing the disease, rendering it a death sentence.
Ebola treatment centers are reduced to places where people go to die alone.
The situation is so dire, doctors in Liberia went on strike over unpaid salaries and a lack of protective gear. In Senegal, closing borders over fears of Ebola spreading have led to food shortages, panic buying, and price hikes. Nigeria has just increased